We are studying Sri Aurobindo's description of the yoga of integral knowledge, which is already different from the conventional path of the yoga of knowledge. It is integral knowledge which is sought, and the approach, therefore, to a path of knowledge is also integral. And yet the path and the goal are primarily paths of knowledge. This is one of the three supporting or starting points of the integral yoga. The yoga of integral knowledge, the yoga of integral works, the yoga of integral love. And the three, like a tripod, support a common framework of the integral yoga proper. So in that sense, we must see it as an entry into the practical form of the integral yoga. In the portion we have been discussing, Sri Aurobindo describes the release from the subjection to the body, where the witnessing consciousness stands back, even feels that the body has no real existence of its own, except as a partial expression of our vital force and mentality, and subsequently a complete recasting of the relationship between the mind, body, and life energies that puts mind in a position of the decisive place where what it decides, the body follows, and not the other way around. He compares this to the way modern science changes the current balance of relationships in nature and uses knowledge of nature's processes to modify and to improve upon nature's own processes and to draw out from them new possibilities and a greater mastery of nature by man. A similar process is now taking place internally within us, where the Purusha witnessing consciousness turning upon body, life energy and mind catches the key principles of their working and their relation and then recasts them to draw out something more. And he summarizes what that something more is. A change of mental and physical state and of relations between the mind and body, which increases the purity and freedom of the being, brings a clear joy and peace, multiplies the power of the mind over itself and over the physical functions. And all of these have physical results, positive and patently obvious. And all of these, he says, this whole process, in fact, it is simply a willed advance of nature in her evolution of the individual, an evolution which she will carry out in any case, but in which she chooses to utilize the human will as her chief agent, because her essential aim is to lead the Purusha to conscious mastery over herself. So we discussed last time this idea that nature is trying to lead the Purusha to wake up and to acquire mastery over her, but as her divine Lord, as a divinized being, not as a petty egoistic being who misuses and destroys nature. But this idea is important, but behind that there's a subtler idea which is placed, that this is simply the willed advance of nature in her evolution of the individual, in which she chooses to utilize the human will as her chief agent. So we see in the whole initial phase of evolution, it is nature who is pushing evolution. But how does she push? The individual is not conscious that she is pushing. The individual is not conscious where this evolution is going. He is perhaps not even conscious that there is an evolution. She is pushing by modifying subtly our interests, our impulses, our likes and dislikes, through instincts, and even to some extent our thoughts and sensations. So as a savage, semi-animal beast, the early human observes lightning perhaps, may experience fear, but then nature prods the mind to start wondering. The same creature observes a stone fall. At first it moves back, and then nature prods the instinct to reach out, to grasp, and to do something with that stone. And in this way, unconscious to the person, the Purusha, the conscious person inside, nature is pushing the evolution by playing around with the instinctive drives. But there are these processes where nature is not pushing through instincts, but by actually utilizing the direct conscious will of the individual. She chooses to utilize the human will as her chief agent. That means our will now is itself her means, and she molds our will directly, and we say, oh, I want to gain mastery over nature, I want to understand her secrets, and I start seeking actively. Unlike an instinct which only works indirectly through fears and other confusions, here there's a direct action of the will to reach out, to know, and to master. Not only externally, but internally. I want to master my own thoughts. I want to master my emotions. I want to overcome my limitations. Who is deciding this? I say, I am choosing, when in fact it is nature utilizing the human will as her conscious agent. And this is a very important idea, that nature herself initially prepares the ground, causes a partial awakening of the individual awareness and will, and then uses that awakened awareness and will as a direct tool for her objects. But it is still she who is doing it. So when in our quest to master nature, we make new discoveries in science, we discover new tools, and in particular recently the discovery of the atomic power, atomic energy, and even more recently the knowledge of genetics. These are all in fact gifts given by nature in our evolution, where she is placing in our hands the fundamental tools by which she has built up the universe and built up our own individual body and infrastructure. With atomic power, we can change matter here, outside us, and perhaps even destroy the universe, because we are entering the domain where she builds the universe. A similar thing is now possible when we turn upon our own biology, discover our genetic mechanism, and there we can destroy life or build life or improve life. and it's a tool she is giving us. The most recent advance, which is I think barely 4 or 5 years old, is a technique called, an acronym which is described as CRISPR. It's a technique by which, by a single intervention, a very precise change can be brought about in the genes, not only in one point but on several points, which allows us to literally knock out genetic defects, correct for inherited diseases in a single move, in a single action, and potentially it could be used the other way, to introduce sicknesses or to destroy the genetic base. It is something, as a technology, so dangerous but so powerful, rather it is so powerful and therefore so dangerous that the discoverers of the technology were in a dilemma at first whether to make it public, whether to simply describe what they have achieved through it and not describe the technique itself. But they decided that in any case others would discover it, so they might as well place it in the public domain. But it has led to a huge discussion in the technology of how to limit the potential for misuse. It is equivalent to what we discovered with atomic energy, now at a genetic level. But we think that we are making an effort, we are discovering, we are struggling to find. In fact, it is nature working through us and using this, using the individual will, utilizing the human will as her chief agent, and empowering humanity in this way to master her processes. So this is a completion of the discussion from last time. Now Sri Aurobindo takes up a very different direction of exploration. That all of this so far was oriented towards the mind mastering the mind-body relationship and the body's capacity. And now there is a complementary side to it, and that is stilling, bringing into silence, staying in a condition of inaction. So this is what he discusses, and its importance. This being said, we must add that in the movement of the path of knowledge, perfection of the mind and body are no consideration at all, or only secondary considerations. The one thing necessary is to rise out of nature to the self by either the swift or the most thorough and effective method possible. And the method we are describing, though not the swiftest, is the most thoroughgoing in its effectivity. And here there arises the question of physical action or inaction. So having set the baseline, that is, we want to get to the self, rise out of nature to the self as quickly as possible or as thoroughly as possible. Now here are two very important distinctions, two branches in the approach, and the two branches can be very different. The point being, though, that as long as we are taking the path of knowledge, perfection of the mind and body are no consideration or only secondary considerations. This we must understand in the context of the larger picture of yoga that Sri Aurobindo places before us. You will recall in the very early stages of the synthesis of yoga, in the first part, which is titled Introduction, which is made of 5 chapters, where he lays the framework of the approach, he discusses how there are 6 major approaches, major systems of yoga, each having its own special features, its own special starting points, its own specialized goals, and he shows how they are all complementary to each other. Of these, the first 5 are the Vedantic methods, where the effort of the individual is the primary driver, and the 6th, which is the Tantric, in which the action of the divine Shakti is the primary driver. Now, in the first 5, if you recall, there are 2 which aim at perfection. One, which is the Hatha Yoga system, which aims at perfection of the physical consciousness, and the other is Raja Yoga, which aims at perfection of the mental consciousness, all of which demand complete, exclusive dedication, leaving practically no time for normal life. Separate from these 2, which aim at perfection, are 3 approaches: Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga, which are practicable in normal life, but which aim at a very narrow object, which do not aim at perfection. And this is this which he is reminding us, that the path of knowledge is not concerned with perfection of the mind and body. But remember, the totality of this is the framework that the integral yoga addresses. We want perfection of the mind, perfection of the body, perfection of the life energies, as well as a practical framework that can be applied in life without withdrawing from life. And towards this, Sri Aurobindo is articulating the practice. So here we recognize that the yoga of knowledge does not aim at perfection, but the way we will practice the yoga of knowledge will not be in contradiction to the goal of perfection. Having understood this, we see now that we want to rise out of nature to self, and there are 2 broad approaches, the most swift and the most thorough and effective, and they are very different. Obviously, the swift is not thorough, and therefore not in attunement to the overall goals of the integral yoga. The more thorough and effective method is more in tune, and that is what he has been describing here. But what is the method which is most swift, and how is it different from this thorough method? One of the swiftest, arguably the approach developed by the Buddha in what is presented as Buddhism, when he set out to solve one problem of existence, the problem of human suffering. Remember, he did not set out to solve other problems. It was a very specific problem, very narrow in its definition. Why do we suffer? How can we get out of suffering? And what is the swiftest way, shortest route out of suffering? In this pursuit, he had already gone through a detailed initiation and practice of various yogic systems, in particular the Raja Yoga tradition in that time. And therefore the same methods he took turned them towards this single goal, and developed the method of separating into mind and then breaking out of mind by killing mind, leaping into the absolute. And it is like an arrow shot from the bow, straight, direct, shortest, swiftest route for getting out of suffering. As long as you're in the domain of relativity, you will have suffering. This was the conclusion he came to. Now, we're not questioning the conclusion itself, but the method which was developed, swiftest, shortest to get out of suffering. In this way, we can see how one could develop the swiftest method, shortest route to get out of nature into self. And this is what we see in the parallel development of the Vedantic practice, where the world is discarded as illusory and the consciousness separated and breaking out of nature, merging into self. But in the process, everything is cut up, discarded, even broken. It's like you're breaking out of the mold to get to something away from life. But since our goal is very different, it includes acceptance of life, transformation and divinization of life, none of these are relevant to us. We may still develop the swiftest method for an integral yoga. We could. But if the goal of the integral yoga is also perfection of nature, then a thorough method would be more relevant. And it is towards this that we begin to lean. And Sri Aurobindo says the method we are describing, though not the swiftest, is the most thoroughgoing in its effectivity. Thorough in arising out of nature to self, but without discarding nature, without destroying, cutting out, or killing any part of nature. Because all those parts later will have to be taken up by the power of the self, now to be divinized and transformed. So, if this be our immediate goal, to attain to self, there arises the question of physical action or inaction. Does it matter whether you take up physical action or not? If in any case the whole process is a psychological emergence in the self. So Sri Aurobindo now discusses this. It is ordinarily considered that the yogin should draw away from action as much as possible, and especially that too much action is a hindrance because it draws off the energies outward. Now this is a matter of practical experience for everybody who takes up yoga. You have just had, let's say, a beautiful concentration, a meditation, or a special descent of an experience, and you find at that stage that any activity, speech, or spreading oneself externally tends to dilute and disperse the experience. On the other hand, if you try to remain in the experience, you find yourself unable to act, unable to speak, perhaps even unable to move. And it seems as if the two are contrary to each other. To have a deep spiritual experience, to hold a deep spiritual experience, seems contrary to action, especially action which exteriorizes. And so he says it is ordinarily considered that you should draw away from action. And it draws energies outwards, and therefore you don't have energy inward. To a certain extent, Sri Aurobindo says, to a certain extent this is true. So when he says to a certain extent, we must ask, well, to what extent? Where is it not true? And he will tell us shortly. And we must note farther that when the mental Purusha takes up the attitude of mere witness and observer, a tendency to silence, solitude, physical calm, and bodily inaction grows upon the being. Now this is the complementary side. The moment we begin to turn our attention to the inner status of the witness and observer, automatically things become quiet. Because the nature of the witness consciousness, of the observer consciousness, is inactivity. So by being or turning towards the witness consciousness, we tend to become quiet. You just have a group of children sit, they are in activity, and you say, watch carefully that bird. Notice what it is doing. And especially if the activity is very subtle, you will find everybody becoming quiet. As the concentration on something which is still takes place, as you enter a state of observer consciousness, automatically all the activities begin to calm down. And there's a tendency to silence, because you can't observe when you are in activity. There's a tendency to solitude. You cannot engage with others if you are to remain in this quiet. And with it, a physical calm and bodily inaction. The body itself relaxes. When we were children, one of our French teachers taught us a poem which went something like this. I don't remember the exact words, but the idea was this. It was the poem about an owl. which was very wise. And the description went, the more it watched, the more it grew in knowledge. The more it grew in knowledge, the more he became quiet. And the more he became quiet, the more he watched. And then it goes into a cycle. You watch, you grow in knowledge, you become more quiet. You watch more, you grow in knowledge, you become more quiet. And it went on and on. And his idea of teaching us this was, well, we as children should become quiet and watch. And I remember still, because it was one of those things where something deeper pushes, there was a reaction in the group. People were agitated about this idea. And I remember myself being somehow troubled by it. Because the implication was, you don't do anything anymore. You become incapable of doing anything. And something inside, we were not perhaps old enough to be able to articulate, something inside felt uncomfortable. Because I want to do, I want to conquer, I want to master my circumstances. To become completely passive and quiet and have a huge knowledge and then be unable to apply it or to express it or to change circumstances based on the knowledge. Something is wrong there. We felt that. But this is the natural direction in which things tend to go. When automatically, when the mental Purusha takes up the attitude of mere witness and observer. Then Sri Aurobindo comments, what is important about this whole direction of experience? The power to do nothing, which is quite different from indolence, incapacity, or aversion to action and attachment to inaction, is a great power and a great mastery. So there are four things which are distortions, which may look similar, but which are not the thing. Indolence, that is inertia. Incapacity, where you want to but you cannot. Aversion, where you have a repulsion from action. And attachment to inaction, where you have a preference for inaction and are unable to act because of that preference. These are the four distortions. If you set these four distortions aside, then the power to do nothing is a great power and a great mastery. Now this is a very suggestive statement. The power to do nothing. First of all, he uses the word power to do nothing. He doesn't say ability to do nothing. What does it mean by power to do nothing? The power, as distinct from energy, is a state of potential held without action at first. So, when we do nothing, there is a certain potential, a power which is held in the energy in doing nothing. And that power, he says, is a great power and is also a great mastery. If you meditate on this, you will discover that in the act of bringing yourself to do nothing, you have to overcome the parts within you which are restlessly wanting to do something. And to come to a point where you actually do nothing at all those parts are overcome. And that's why the mastery. But on the other hand, in coming to this state, there is a concentration, a gathering of awareness. And as you gather and intensify the awareness, there is an intensification of the concentration and of power. And when you come into a state of absolute stillness and calm, then there is almost as if a kind of a dense presence which is gathered, which is a power, and it is a great power. Great because It can act without movement. And when it chooses to move, it can infuse into movement a great power. So there's a term which is in modern discourse becoming popular, a term which is static power. Meaning, without movement, you are exercising a power. When the Prime Minister enters the room and sits at the back and watches the discussions proceeding, or the principal or the boss, whoever you may take who is responsible or who has authority or whom you respect. When the boss enters the room, suddenly everybody becomes more conscious. Suddenly people are more careful what they speak, how they behave, because they will be accountable, because they are being watched. Now the person who has entered the room, if he has especially something of this power, then the presence makes the difference even if people don't know he is there. The awareness of the divine presence in the room changes immediately the whole dynamic, even if you are not conscious of it. There is something which is acting unseen. It is this which he is referring to as the great power and a great mastery. In the very act of mastering oneself, in the concentration involved, in the gathering and centering involved, there is the accumulation of power. And although you appear to do nothing, the power itself acts. Now this is the condition at first in what we will describe as static power. But the same power can pour into an action which you do. And a person who thus sits can speak one word and infuse that one word with the power necessary. And this was a very common experience people had when they met the mother. They would enter her room and immediately all the thoughts which they had come with would appear so silly or would be forgotten. So a person has prepared a list, I'm going to ask these questions, and he is repeating the list to his mind while he is waiting, but he enters the room and poof, the whole mind becomes blank. I forgot what my question was. It doesn't matter anymore. Or the person asks a question which at that moment is a real need, and the mother's simple answer may be yes, but you feel in that answer as if a whole ocean of energy is poured into you for the actualization. And it is this power which is now released through the vehicle of a word or a gesture or even a look or even a thought. So this power to do nothing is a great power and a great mastery, as long as it is not these four distortions. And then he explains how important it is. The rest absolutely from action is as necessary for the Jnana Yogin as the power to cease absolutely from thought, as the power to remain indefinitely in sheer solitude and silence, and as the power of immovable calm. For the Jnana Yogin, this is absolutely necessary as, and he gives three other variations. Up these. So the first of these, so the thing is the power to rest absolutely from action, meaning absolutely. Not just rest and then waiting in rest, while something inside is restlessly agitating. To come to a complete rest where everything within you is in absolute stillness. So cease. To rest absolutely from action is as necessary as, and then he gives these three things, but for the Jnana Yogin, a seeker of knowledge, as necessary as the power to cease absolutely from thought. And we have already seen here in an earlier discussion how important that was to come to rest in silence. And in particular, you will recall Sri Aurobindo's very pregnant statement of the importance of silence and peace, because they are the very nature of the self. So, a few chapters before, in a complete silence only is the silence heard. In a pure peace only is its being revealed. Therefore, to us, the name of that is the silence and the peace. Of course, silence capital and peace capital, meaning of the self. And so, in the earlier discussions, the importance of this purification of the thought, and in particular being able to bring the mind into stillness and silence as a first step towards becoming conscious of the self. We have seen the importance of that. We will also see its importance again, although we have read that text, in opening to higher ranges of consciousness, of developing intuition. But this coming back to rest in silence, completely free from thought, is an essential foundation of the whole yoga of knowledge, opening the passage to higher knowledge. Remember, the higher knowledge is not intellectual knowledge, but knowledge which is known in and as a living experience, for which the first requirement. So for the jnanin, the power to cease absolutely from thought is as important. And next, as the power to remain indefinitely in sheer solitude and silence. To be able to remain all alone and in silence as long as necessary, indefinitely, perhaps even forever. And you will recall from Savitri those very famous lines: in moments when the inner lamps are lit and life's cherished guests are left outside, our soul sits alone and speaks to its gulfs. And then he describes what are the various kinds of spiritual experience which begin then. But this ability to come back into silence and then to be alone with yourself is a prerequisite to enter in relation with the divine. Another quotation from Sri Aurobindo goes something like this: the soul that can live alone with itself meets God. And you wonder why. When you meditate on this idea, we discover, as long as we need something, that thing pulls us out. That thing binds us, limits us. It is only when we get free from needing anything that we can be alone. Solitude is not possible as long as you are in neediness of something else. When you have lost all need for everything, then you can be alone, and because there is no need, you can stay in that aloneness without being lonely, without being restless, without being bound, completely free. And then you are available to give yourself exclusively to the divine. And until you are able to give yourself exclusively to the divine, you cannot meet the divine. The exclusivity is a prerequisite for the breakthrough. In fact, as a general principle, we may say this exclusive focus of concentration, where everything else is cut out, is a prerequisite for any breakthrough for whatever you aim to realize. You want to solve this problem and get to the deeper insight, well, you have to concentrate to the exclusion of all else. And at the moment where you lose all else, you have the breakthrough and the identification and the knowledge and experience. The same thing turned to the divine means you lose everything else, forget everything else, be completely alone, and then you meet God. So this remaining indefinitely in sheer solitude is the second, and then and silence, and then the third. And as the power of immovable calm, to be able to hold within oneself that power and that calm which is not moved by anything. You'll see here degrees in the whole listing. First, to be able to silence the thought is in a way a negative action. You are removing activity and coming to silence. The second is a transitory passage where now you remove all connections, you are no more dependent, but also you are free, you are turning towards a greater freedom. And the third is an affirmative, a positive character, where you are in a power of immovable calm. All three are connected and one leads to the next. So when you can be in this way concentrated and alone, you can gather in yourself that calm, that peace as a solid, real, concrete experience until it materializes to the point where it becomes almost physical in its density, and at that point it is immovable. At that point, whatever may happen externally, you find centrally you are unaffected. Even if superficially there may be reactions, which should not be if they are all, those parts are also included in this immovable calm, but at least centrally one remains unaffected. We see something of this in the lives of many great saints, that even the tiger coming in front of them used to become calm because of their immovable calm. The Buddha stands in front of the mad elephant and the elephant becomes calm, and so on. In the descriptions we have heard of people meeting Sri Aurobindo and the mother during the darshan, there is a similar description. It was as if you were entering physically a dense peace, as if entering a water, entering a dense substance of peace, and you were completely overwhelmed by the peace, and everything within you changed and remained thus for several days. Often for most people it was as if the impact of that darshan lasted 3 days, in which they didn't know who they were, they didn't know where they were. They were either in a state indrawn or in some blissful state, unable to function normally during those 3 days. But these three things which are necessary in the approach of Jnana Yoga, Sri Aurobindo puts them in relation to this capacity or the power to do nothing is as important as these three things. It is a great power and a great mastery. The power to rest absolutely from action is as necessary for the Jnana Yogin as the power to cease absolutely from thought, as the power to remain indefinitely in sheer solitude and silence, and as the power of immovable calm. Now in all this, we are reminded of the sages withdrawing into the forest or into their caves in order precisely to be like this. Because doing this is so much more difficult if you are in activity, if you have to deal with people, with situations, with a dripping tap which has to be repaired, or a bulb which has got fused, or and so on. It's so much easier to just let it all go and withdraw. But you see the danger when you withdraw, the tendency for indolence, incapacity, aversion to action, and attachment to inaction. All of these can grow easily, which he will shortly describe. But the importance of this, attaining this, is now the theme. Whoever is not willing to embrace these states is not yet fit for the path that leads towards the highest knowledge. As long as we feel that this is not important, or that something within us resists attaining to these states, we are not yet fit for the path which leads towards the highest knowledge. So there are many gradations, many degrees involved already. The path which leads towards, you have not yet reached, you are not yet even going there, but it's in that direction. And even to move in that direction, you are not yet fit if you're not ready for these states of absolute silencing. And he says, whoever is unable to draw towards them is as yet unfit for its acquisition. Having got onto the path, you are unable to actually draw towards these states, and that means you are not yet fit for the acquisition of the highest knowledge. So he has given you two statements in different degrees. First, about entering the path itself. If you're not ready to attain these states, you're not ready for the path. Having got onto the path, if you're unable to draw towards these states, then you're not yet fit for the acquisition of the highest knowledge. Because the highest knowledge requires a complete loss of all things which come in the way, and a complete stilling of the whole being, which allows you to then to enter in contact with that which is absolute silence and absolute peace. So this is the logic of this statement. At the same time, it must be added that the power is enough. It doesn't mean that you have to actually be constantly in immobility. It is the power which is needed. So he says, the abstention from all physical action is not indispensable. The aversion to action, mental or corporeal, is not desirable. The seeker of the integral state of knowledge must be free from attachment to action and equally free from attachment to inaction. And now comes the typical reconciliation that Sri Aurobindo brings, having shown us how important this is. In the actual application in the integral yoga, it is the power which is necessary, the power to be in complete stillness and do nothing, to rest absolutely from action. It is the power which is necessary. But how will you develop the power if you don't put into practice the effort? So obviously there will be phases, there will be efforts where you make effort to become absolutely still and do nothing. Come to rest in no action. And stay in that condition of no action without restlessness for as long as necessary. You will practice these things until the power to do it becomes established. But the aversion which may come from such efforts, the aversion to action, is not desirable, whether it is aversion to mental action or corporeal action. Now this is the difficulty practically which happens. When we make initially an effort to bring ourselves to stillness, do nothing and stay in nothing, very quickly we enjoy the state so much. Afterwards, to get back into activity and do things becomes not so nice, because you're losing such a good feeling, such a deep connection, such a state of exaltation, whatever it is, you begin to lose it. Also, the tendency in the body to inertia comes in very easily. Or there is a disconnect between the outer part and the inner part. You come to rest in the inner part, the outer parts from lack of activity have lost the habit. And when you want to act, you are unable to. It's as if the body doesn't move, although I want to move. This is often the case when you come out from very deep meditation. There's a period when you just can't get up, you just can't move, you can't speak. And it's good to stay in that. Good to extend that state as long as possible, because eventually the activity and restlessness of the surface things will come. You don't need to hasten it. Rather, spend the time to concretize and deepen the habit and the familiarity with these inner states. But you notice at that point, the outer layers don't function even. They're unable to function. And when they're left in that state long enough, they tend to get into a habit. Later, when you are not in that inward state, you will find somehow the inertia is there. You don't feel like, or having got into the activity, you don't feel like continuing in the activity for too long. You long to come back to rest. And there is a tendency in those parts. Equally, if you are not used to using the intellect, from being in a silence of the mind and opening to intuitive consciousness, after a while the habit of the intellectual thinking begins to weaken. And then when you have to exercise the mind in a complex, argumentative thought process, you find it not so interesting. You may even find it difficult after a while to get into that. Rather, one is used to seeing directly and not thinking out, and the habit of thinking fades. Remember two occasions particularly where this was almost a problem. The first time was at a certain stage when, as a result of the efforts of my teacher, I was in a highly interiorized state for about 2 years, just before he left his body. And it was such a deep state that I was unable to function other than the normal activities of life. And I remember once walking down the road and I saw on the other side somebody cycling, and she had tied a mat for her asanas, exercises, to the back of the cycle, and it slipped and fell. And as I watched this, something inside me wanted to call out and say, "Oh, it was so beautiful, it was so perfect." And everything was seen in perfect harmony. A young boy walking on the side walked up, picked up the mat and walked away, and everything was exactly as it should have been. And there was nothing which was out of place. And it was such a beautiful scene. I watched, and by the time I could even respond, she had moved away. But I recall at that point, I was wondering why I couldn't respond, although I wanted to. The body was moving, I was walking. And I couldn't understand why I was unable to speak or call out. And the other time was when we were installing the relics in Sri Lanka, and they had organized that many people would take the relics at different stages. Somebody had taken it to Sri Lanka, then I was supposed to take from the house where it was kept to the center, and then someone else from the Ramakrishna mission was supposed to take it and place it at the installation. And I remember holding it and feeling Sri Aurobindo's presence so concretely that I was unable to move. I had to walk, but that was still doable, but I was unable to speak. And then they were lighting the lamps, and one of the lower lamps would not light. And I wanted to say, "Give it to the ladies, only the men have lit the upper lamps, the lamps need to be lit by the ladies." I wanted to speak, but I couldn't. The words just wouldn't come out. But there was no strain, there was no struggle, it was just a disconnect. Just those parts don't function anymore. But it is easy to see how a person who lives in the cave in a state of deep interiorization for long periods in the day would find himself thus unable to function. He would still act within the normal domain of moving around, walking, eating food, but to do anything out of the norm would seem almost impossible. And if one stays like this long enough, those parts of the mind and the body could easily fall into some kind of either inertia or attachment to inaction. And Sri Aurobindo points here that any kind of aversion to action, mental or corporeal, is not desirable. The seeker of the integral state of knowledge must be free from attachment to action and equally free from attachment to inaction. So, to be free from attachment to action seems relatively easy because we all like to come to rest. But that's not really freedom from attachment to action. It means actually it does not matter whether I act or I don't act. Both would be equal. In which case you should be able to act just as easily as you would not act. Then only you can say you have equally detachment from both action and inaction. So when a person says, I am not attached to action, therefore I don't do this work, that would be an error. If you're truly not attached, you should be able to do that work as easily as you are not doing it, and therefore do it. But that doesn't happen. Then we know that it is a self-deception. Especially must any tendency to mere inertia of mind or vitality or body be surmounted. Now, it's only a tendency which he's talking of. It doesn't mean you've got inertia of mind or vital or physical. A tendency towards that inertia must be surmounted. And if that habit is found growing in the nature, the will of the Purusha must be used to dismiss it. So we find this tendency gradually happening, let's say as a tendency, and the will should immediately block it, refuse it, change it. And this is the reason why nature, right at the beginning, from childhood, exaggerates in us the tendency for action. So that later, when we develop the higher possibilities and the experiences of silence, we have already had enough activity that we do not slide into passivity and into inertia. You will see in the particular sequence that nature uses, to get free from tamas, she uses rajas. Only having passed through rajas that we enter into sattva. If rajas has not been sufficiently developed, then the sattvic tendency falls back into the tamasic. And again one has to pass through rajas and develop rajas before being able to rise into sattva. So all of this, it is assumed, has been sufficiently developed in the personality, and now we are only dealing with the tendency. And a tendency coming, one can push it out, will it with the will of the Purusha. So here's the point interesting. Your consciousness is a witness, but the will can exercise. The will can exercise to change, to catch something which is erroneous, a new tendency, a wrong tendency, and it can act. When it acts, it may act purely psychologically. There's a tendency and we refuse it, throw it out, or we counter it by forcing a certain activity. Eventually, a state arrives when the life and the body perform as mere instruments the will of the Purusha in the mind, without any strain or attachment, without their putting themselves into the action with that inferior, eager and often feverish energy which is the nature of their ordinary working. They come to work as forces of nature work, without the fret and toil and reaction characteristic of life in the body when it is not yet master of the physical. When we attain to this perfection, then action and inaction become immaterial. So this is the direction in which the whole training is moving. And he says there comes a point eventually when life and body perform as mere instruments the will of the Purusha in the mind without any strain or attachment. So this would be the result of the sustained effort in this direction, covering what we have discussed last time and now. When the Purusha stands back from the life force and the body, works upon this freedom of the Purusha observing consciousness, from that freedom trains the body, life and even the mind to being quiet and to being in action, to overcoming limitations and habits, changing the balance of the relationship between body, life and mind. A degree of transparency and freedom and purification takes place where the will of the Purusha can act. These body and life work as instruments, and it is almost automatic. And at that point, he says, it is possible that they work without this attachment to action or inaction. But that comes later. But we keep this as our reference because we are moving in this direction. But he puts a very interesting description here. What is their normal working which has been overcome when you reach this state? without putting themselves into the action with that inferior, eager, and often feverish energy, which is the nature of their ordinary working. So when the life force and the body have to do some work, someone says, do it. What do? You rush. There's an eager energy, there's a feverish energy sometimes, and there is an inferior action. There's a drive, there's an agitation, there's an imbalance, there is a personal engagement, and there is a disturbance throughout. The consciousness is not flowing smoothly like a stream of water, it is bubbling. There is agitation. And he contrasts this with the working of as forces of nature without the fret and toil and reaction characteristic of life in the body when it is not yet master of the physical. So the forces of nature, when they work, they do not work like this. They flow smoothly, they do what they have to do. So if you observe, for example, the automatic functions of the biology, the heart is pumping, the blood is flowing, and the whole thing is happening smoothly. There is not in your hearts pumping this feverish agitation. On the other hand, when you have to do something, I need now to perk up my energy, to get fresh, to get prepared for a challenge. I exercise myself, work up a certain state of excitement. At that point, the heart is going pop, 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 pop. And the blood flowing is also in a state of pulsation, pounding, agitation, disturbance. But when you come back to rest, and now you're doing nothing, the heart is still pumping, the blood is still moving, but in a smooth flow. And this is the way nature works. Without the restlessness, the exaggeration of effort, and the reactions which are characteristic of life in the body, when the life is not master of the physical. Once life has mastered the physical, everything is smooth, effortless, not restless. So it is towards this that the whole working has to move, and it happens when the right balance of the relationship of mind with life and body has been developed, and there is no more this eagerness and feverish energy. When we attain to this perfection, then action and inaction become immaterial. Since neither interferes with the freedom of the soul or draws it away from its urge towards the self or its poise in the self. So when the activities are moving so smoothly, then your concentration can be turned to the self. You may even be immersed in the self, and yet nothing will be disturbing from that state of alignment. And so this is the direction that we are aiming at. I recall in one of the interviews we had done with the head of the engineering section, Vishwanath Da, who was at that time also as a young boy working in the radio and recording section of the ashram. They were setting up the recording facility for the mother's talks. And in the interview, he shared with us many interesting incidents, but one observation which he saw consistently across years. He said the mother would come to her chair in the playground and sit down, and then she would be meeting one after another people. There would be the class, there would be distribution of groundnuts, activities going on for a long time, often up to 2 or 3 hours. During that time, never once her body was ever restless. Now imagine somebody sitting at the chair and doing work, meeting people. After a while, you will at least adjust your seat, because somewhere the blood flow is blocked, somewhere some muscle is tight, somewhere some joint is oddly placed or paining. Nothing. Should be sitting. And now imagine after 2 or 3 hours where your muscles have been inactive, they become tight or they become restless, or they become agitated. And if you have to get up, you would go, and then make all kinds of strange adjustments, stretching the body. Nothing. So the way he described it, he said, she sat down, she was there completely concentrated for 2 hours, 3 hours, and then she would just get up and walk. Nothing, no adjustment, no restlessness, no stretching, nothing. Just getting up and walking off as if nothing had happened. And you can see this in some of the videos. Now I do not recall where it was. In some of the ashram video recordings of the early years of the ashram, you will see the mother sitting, and then she has finished the distribution and she looks left and right to see nobody else is left, and then cluck, she gets up. There's no resting on the hand, no leaning on anything. She just gets up straight and walks out. That's it. And so even in the physical consciousness, you're able to bring a certain freedom. The life energy is flowing, is in perfect alignment with the material substance and with the mind. Everything is smooth, spontaneous. And this, if I recall right, would be for the mother at an age when she was 60 or above 60. She was going to the playground till 1960, till 62. And that's even 80, up to 80. She was being able to get up like this. At the age of 80, consider what that means. In principle, one could be like this all through. The aging process in the appearance of the body may be there. The aging process in the weakening of the physical capacity may be there. Perhaps now I cannot lift anymore something which weighs 50 kilos, or I cannot hold it up long enough. But this smoothness of the life energy and its working in the body, this can be there irrespective of the aging process. In fact, one of the side effects of this would be the aging process itself would be enormously slowed down, because the symptoms of aging would be much less or practically non-existent, except for change of form, wrinkles on skin and so on. But this state of perfection arrives later in the yoga, and till then the law of moderation laid down by the Gita is the best for us. And now this is in context of action and inaction. The law of moderation. Too much mental or physical action then is not good, since excess draws away too much energy and reacts unfavorably upon the spiritual condition. Too little also is not good, since defect leads to a habit of inaction and even to an incapacity which has afterwards to be surmounted with difficulty. Now this is put in the context, remember, of the yoga. Of course, this would apply to anybody in a normal life, but we are putting it in the context of yoga, and in a yoga where the effort of the concentration is to enter in relation with the self and live in the consciousness of the self. So he says, too much mental or physical action is not good, since excess draws away too much energy and reacts unfavorably upon the spiritual condition. So the logic is very clear. When you do too much activity, whether physical or mental, the energy is going outwards, but energy, remember, is one. When it turns outwards, then there is not enough inwards. And as a result, there is a weakening of the power to remain inwardly concentrated, a weakening perhaps even of the contact with the inner presence, and the spiritual condition tends to lose its hold, tends to lose its state, or the consciousness begins to withdraw or becomes abstract, unable to connect to the material consciousness, and it as if evaporates inner or higher state, and you lose the contact with it. So there has to be a balance where too much energy is not sucked out to the external physical or mental activity. On the other hand, too little is not good, since defect, meaning insufficiency here, leads to a habit of inaction. If you don't do enough external activity, after a while the whole machinery of thought and the body gets into the habit of inaction. And even from the habit to an incapacity. And afterwards that has to be surmounted with difficulty. So here's the interesting part. In the integral yoga, eventually you'll have to overcome that habit or that incapacity of inaction. Because later, when you find you're taking up the body consciousness to transform it, to make the body an instrument for the divine action, or the mind to be an instrument for expressing the divine consciousness, you will find there the resistance. A resistance even to receiving the spiritual force, because the spiritual force may seek to use the body and mind as an instrument, and then it is resisting because of the habit of inertia or incapacity. And then you'll have to struggle. And he says, surmounted with difficulty later. Why is it difficult later? Because at that point, the primary drives in those parts have already been removed. The instinctive drives are not there. The desire-driven activity. You do not have even perhaps a personal interest. And it's very easy to fall back into some kind of inertia and say, I don't care if something happens to me or not, whether I live or I die, does not matter. I'm in my self. It doesn't matter. So at that point, what is your motivation to make the effort to overcome? And so there is a much greater difficulty later on when you try to surmount this inertia or incapacity. And this is the reason why you will see the logic of nature's training. She puts the instincts of activities early on. In the practical life of the ashram, we see how the mother had organized work for each person. Often the work was the contrary of the person's natural inclination. I remember one of the sadhakas from Orissa narrating, when he came to the ashram, joined, he was a professor then with a very well-developed intellect, having read Sri Aurobindo extensively, and he expected that the mother would give him the job of teaching Sri Aurobindo's writings in the school. And instead, mother gave him work to do in the dining room, to wash vessels. And he struggled with it because it was not natural for him. He was used to being free in thought, but in body there was a huge resistance to physical activity, tiredness coming from it, strain in the body. The mind was feeling neglected. There was nothing interesting to think about or do. It was unable to handle the disuse of the mind. And he said for almost 2 months he struggled with this. And he said, what is this? Mother has given me something so contrary. And she doesn't even know, she doesn't understand. Eventually the whole thing calmed down. And he said, why am I even thinking like that? It is mother who has given. She has given in her wisdom, and I should accept. So he made this very concentrated effort to just accept. This is the work given by the mother. I accept with joy, and I do with full attention and concentration. And he said the day that he attained to this, he got word from the mother that he was reassigned now to teach in the school. It is so amazing, the kind of precision with which she monitored each person's need, allocated to them the work and reassigned circumstances. But you see in this particular example how the inertia of the body to work, for a person who has developed the mind and does not have perhaps inertia in the mind, but has restlessness in the mind, because he has to be thinking important, useful, intellectual thoughts, otherwise the mind gets bored and the body of course quickly tires. And she gave a work which involved the complete opposite. She could have given work where the mind was also engaged with the body, but she gave something where the mind was not involved, and he had to learn to become quiet and keep the mind passive, irrespective of what he was doing, while being physically active. So it was just the perfect requirement. And so it is much more difficult later on, and we understand why, but it must be done eventually. Still, periods of absolute calm, solitude, and cessation from works are highly desirable and should be secured as often as possible for that recession of the soul into itself which is indispensable to knowledge. So we must have these periods. And so you see in the schedule of the ashram's work, the mother gave work to everybody according to their nature as necessary. And in one of the interviews we had with Ravindraji, who was assigned to give work to people, he narrated how mother used to tell people when they asked how long we should work, mother said, Ravindra says you should work 8 hours every day. So after hearing this many times, finally Ravindra asked mother, why is it that you say Ravindra says? Why don't you say you should work 8 hours on your own authority? Why do you say Ravindra says? And then the mother explained that if she gave on her own authority, if she said you should do 8 hours and the person does not do 8 hours, then there would be spiritual consequences. Because there is the Guru's order, in a sense. When she says you should do and the person has not done, it's going against her, isn't it? So she said by saying Ravindra says, it was a way of protecting them from consequences if they didn't follow that. It's a very interesting insight, but also shows the extent of her compassion even in these things. But the idea being still that you had a fixed routine of work. And in that work, the mother discouraged people from not working when they were sick, or when it rained, or when it was too hot, or when it was too cold, or whatever it is, excuse. Even when you should be able to go do the work as far as possible. And this is the discussion we had last time when Sri Aurobindo describes the different conditions in which the body is unable to function normally. All those can be overcome by rearranging the relationship between mind, life and body. And so even when there is a fever, perhaps the body cannot function to the same extent as normal, but you should be able to function somewhat at least. And by doing this, you are changing the relationship until a situation arises when even in the midst of high fever, you will be absolutely able to function normally. Or even able to function well above normal under all circumstances. So that's the kind of direction in which she was nudging people. And the result is seen in many people even today who have been through that kind of training. You will find even today, now some of them are at least 40 years older than when they were doing that under her training. And I see even today with some of them, they are in fever, you'll find their face looks a little pale, their movements are a little abnormal, but they go to work, they do their work, they come back, and that's it, because mother taught us. In most cases though, in the very act of directing the body in this way, that habit of illness began to fade, and if at all it came, it was only for a shorter duration, momentary, not affecting too much the overall balance. So in the routine I was describing how mother put a framework where you had, let's say, 8 hours of activity, come what may, even whether you're sick or not. And then you had also those hours when you sat with her for meditation. And at least for a certain period, there were several points of meditation. There was one in the morning when the mother would come for the darshan. People would gather and she would infuse into people a special energy for the whole day, For this action of the force to take place in the mind, life, body, working during the dynamic activities, and for the effectivity of the work itself. And with many people, they recall how they could do so much more than was normally possible. And it was done in a different state of consciousness, with a very different attitude. And the whole relationship with the work and with people was completely different. Again, there would be a meditation sometimes in the evening. There were brief darshans, which were called window darshan, vegetable darshan, etc. But the fixed time for meditation was there in the evening, when she would again sit with everybody. Of course, because of the work, it became later and later. But the idea was that there were these periods in which there would be an inward turn with a deep concentration. Periods of absolute calm, solitude, cessation from works, for that recession of the soul into itself, which is indispensable to knowledge. There are many who subsequently, because they grew up here as children, who were not part of these meditations, or mother made for them the classes in the playground where she spoke to them, followed by a brief meditation, so who never got into this routine. And many of them have subsequently even avoided meditating, very conveniently taking the excuse that, oh, my work is my meditation. It's not enough to say it. If you do the work with that concentration, where it actually becomes a dwelling on the self, then only you can say that my work is my meditation. But to do work with concentration is not the same as the meditation, because the goal of the meditation here is deepening the contact with the self, the recession of the soul into itself. And so if we cannot do that in the work, we must set aside a time for it. And then, having done that concentrated time of absolute calm, solitude and cessation from works for the inward turn, to extend that state or that contact into the activity. So it goes both ways. From the state of meditation to move into work, extending the meditation into the work, and then from the work to come back to rest into the silence of the self. And this back and forth movement eventually bridges the two. And there comes a time when some part within us remains always in attunement to that inner silence and self, while some part of the outside, basking in the glow of that silence of the self, may be in activity, but with this new rhythm, with this perfect balance of life in the body, where everything moves smoothly as the flow of forces of nature, guided perhaps by the Purusha in the mind, indicating, guiding and directing. And such would be an ideal balance that we work towards. So with this, Sri Aurobindo completes the theme of this chapter, which is release from subjection to the body. The next chapter is the release from the mind and the heart. And so the last two paragraphs of this chapter now prepare us for that. From the body, we move to the other functions of life energy. And here Sri Aurobindo makes a practical distinction of the life force working in the body because of the different domains in which it works. Its functioning is also different in these two domains. It is this which gives rise to a very peculiar vocabulary of the integral yoga, which you do not find in any other tradition, and that is the distinction between lower vital and higher vital. You will find here in Sri Aurobindo's letters and in the common use, sometimes loosely people speak of lower vital and higher vital. But Sri Aurobindo does not use it loosely. He makes a very clear distinction. The life force being one everywhere, when it works in the body and material substance, gets embedded in which you pour into the bottom of the muddy lake. As the water pours in, it stirs up the mud and the water becomes dull, dark, brown, muddy. Light cannot penetrate anymore. And this is the domain of the lower vital, life force working in the physical consciousness, where the instincts associated with the physical consciousness are darkened because the light of conscious awareness do not enter them. For example, greed, jealousy, anger. I don't want to get angry, but I'm helplessly carried away by the anger. I don't want to be greedy, I'm trying to restrain myself, but who is this I? The mind is unable to control this part which is life force and body. It's operating in a different domain. The same life force, when it functions in the mind and creates in the mind instinctive movements which are primarily life driven, the heart, emotions, it has a very different character. There also there is a dulling, but you are much more conscious. You are perhaps more easily able to restrain, and the flame is no more covered but is smoky. And the functioning of the life force is different in these two, and therefore we need to make a practical distinction. Therefore we call it lower vital and higher vital. So it is towards this that Sri Aurobindo now leads us in preparation for the next chapter, when he says, while dealing thus with the body, we have necessarily to deal also with the prana or life energy. For practical purposes, we have to make a distinction between the life energy as it acts in the body, the physical prana, and the life energy as it acts in support of the mental activities, the psychical prana. It is this vocabulary which later becomes lower vital and higher vital. Physical prana and psychical prana. For we lead always a double life, mental and physical. And the same life energy acts differently and assumes a different aspect according as it lends itself to one or the other. In the body, it produces those reactions of hunger, thirst, fatigue, health, disease, physical vigor, etc., which are the vital experiences of the physical frame. For the gross body of man is not like the stone or the earth. It is a combination of two sheaths, the vital and the food sheath. Food here is translation of anna, annamaya, physical. And its life is a constant interaction of these two. Still, the life energy and the physical frame are two different things, and in the withdrawal of the mind from the absorbing sense of the body, we become increasingly sensible to the prana and its action in the corporeal instrument, and can observe more and more, and we can observe and more control its operations. Practically, in drawing back from the body, we draw back from the physical life energy also, even while we distinguish the two and feel the latter nearer to us than the mere physical instrument. The entire conquest of the body comes, in fact, by the conquest of the physical life energy. So this paragraph deals with the life force working in the body, and he has touched upon it only in passing, not gone too deep. But everything which he has discussed for the physical applies to the life force in the physical also. And the next chapter takes up the upper part of the life force working in the mind and its characteristics, which are very different. We'll touch this paragraph again next time when we continue, because there is something important to discuss about life force in the body. But the important idea here is, as you separate from the body consciousness, you become conscious of life force working in the body. That as you gain control over life force in the body. Through life force in the body, you attain to mastery of the physical. Because mind is unable to enter into direct contact with the physical substance. If mind could directly move physical substance, then the mind could move the physical object of the flower. Mind is able only to move directly the point of contact, which is life force in the physical substance. And through life force, it moves the physical substance. Therefore, when I want to move my hand, the mind puts a will, an intention, which moves life energy, which as life energy translates itself into the most gross physical life energy of the nervous system, which then moves the muscle, which activates the muscle, which moves the bone, and the hand moves. Mind itself is not able to move the hand directly. It has to pass through life energy. And the life energy itself goes through a translation of its pure free action, where it links to mind, to the part of the life energy embedded in matter, which in its grossest form takes the character of the nervous impulse. And so when we free ourselves from the body's tendencies, we become conscious of the life force. We discover in the body itself 5 functionings of the life force. Now this we have discussed in other texts. I believe we covered this also in our studies of the Upanishads also, but the 5 functions of the life force we notice in the body's functioning, and as we learn to master them, we find through those 5 functions of life energy, we are able to control the body biology functions. The names of the 5 Pancha Vayu, 5 Vayus or 5 energy flows, are Prana, Apana, Samana, Udana, and Vyana. In their physical working, prana is that functioning which draws life energy into the body and is primarily operative in the upper part from the solar plexus upwards. And primary function of the lungs physically is to draw prana. Through the physical action of breathing, it's actually drawing upon prana. But if you have become conscious of the prana energy as it is drawn while breathing, the breathing itself, the physical breathing, can become less, and you can draw as much prana even with less physical movement. And this is what tends to happen when we go deep into meditation. The breathing tends to subside until it feels almost as if it's about to stop. And if you get scared, then it breaks the meditation. But if you ignore it, the body finds its balance. But the energy is still drawn, and you come out of the meditation more fresh. Without the oxygen going in the same proportion, how is that possible? Because oxygen itself is a representation of prana and a physical carrier of prana, and the prana itself can be drawn directly. And so we learn to become conscious of that part of the body life functioning where energy is drawn in from the universe. That's the prana vayu. The second is apana vayu, which is throwing out. And this is associated also with the physical substance being thrown out by the body through the excretory organs. And it is through the apana vayu that the throwing out of waste takes place. And the balance between the two is held by the third energy, which is samana, which literally means the balancing. And when this balancing is not proper, many kinds of illnesses can take place. There are people who are hyperactive and restless because the balance between the incoming and outgoing is not properly held. And so they have always an excess and they have to restlessly waste it out. On the other hand, there are those people who are always in a state of depletion because the apana is in excess and the incoming is less, and they are always low. Whatever they may do, they may eat a lot, they may exercise a lot, they may breathe a lot, but there seems always to be an imbalance. And so the balancing energy is the other, which allows us then consciously to increase energy when we want, to reduce when we don't want, and to hold the balance of the inflow and outflow, which makes us effectively a dynamo of life energy consciously when these three are mastered. The fourth is the udana, which is the energy which links the body life to the higher levels of consciousness. It is an upward going prana. Upward not physically, but upward in grades of consciousness. But because grades of consciousness are mapped along the chakras in upward movement, the feeling when the consciousness turns upwards is a feeling of rising, of an energy rising upwards like this. So you will notice when a person sits for meditation, there are people who are sitting sloppily. And maybe they go in, maybe they don't, but there will be always a struggle of inertia. There are people who sit like this, with Padmasana perhaps, and as if the energy pulled up, and the whole concentration is as if rising up. And they may go in, but you can feel the energy is upwardly turned. And you can feel a certain freshness also. Now the body posture is not the thing, it is this upward turn of energy which opens to higher gradations of energy. If somebody is sitting passive, especially with the lower part of the body slouched on a chair, as they say couch potato on the couch, which forces the body automatically into this poise. If you suddenly remember at that point, oh my God, I have to prepare for an exam or a presentation or a meeting, I have to read up, study. And now you take up something to study which involves concentration of your mind, you'll notice immediately you have to straighten your body, straighten this lower part, and the energy comes here. And perhaps you're leaning forward because your energy is up here. And during that time you'll find all the lower parts are as if constricted, as if a toothpaste squeezed and the energy turned up. And this is typically a sign of the udana tendency, an upward turning of energy. But it stops with the thought, with the mind. But it is the same thing which turned like this, the whole body consciousness and all the levels, gradations, can turn upwards and intensely, just with your awareness concentrated, turn upwards to receive, to invoke Mother's light and force from above, or just to open oneself to the vast presence above. And it is an udana function of the physical life energy. When this udana is thus mastered, one is able to remain in conscious contact with whatever gradations of higher consciousness one has opened to more easily, and even in the midst of activity, and even draw nourishment from there. The practical result is there is a reduction in need for physical food automatically. You still feel fully energized, but if you're not careful, you may not realize that the body still needs something, and perhaps there is a nutritional imbalance, though you feel a certain freshness of energy. In some cases, I have noticed, for people who tend to be more drawing energy in this eating food. For people who draw energy from the physical nourishment of the food, after eating a meal, you feel energized. But for people who tend to draw from above, after eating a meal, you tend to feel dulled. Because the consciousness has come down. The udana energy turns downwards because all the life energies are drawn to digestive processes in the stomach. And this is the reason why you'll see, if for a few days you are required to be in intense sustained concentration, you will tend not to eat too much. Because you're drawing, or your energies are turned upwards, you're drawing from above, perhaps. But you don't feel hungry, and you don't feel like eating too much because of the dulling effect of the meal. Fourth, prana. And then the fifth is vyana, which is the life energy as it turns outwards, spreading into the whole body to spread awareness and to activate the perception of the awareness through the senses. Meaning, when you go into a deep interiorized state and your consciousness is as if withdrawing from the world, from the outer senses, and then turning in and then going deep, you lose awareness of the world. Perhaps you lose awareness of the body. When you return from that and become conscious of the body again, your body feels dull, insensitive, perhaps numb. And then there's a period when gradually you recover body awareness. That's the Vyana. That's the life force moving, now spreading into the body tissue, but activating as it spreads all the senses. So the sensations of the skin surface, of the muscle tissue, of the sensory organs and sensations, they begin to return. When blood flow is blocked, when you're sitting in an odd position and the legs become numb, primarily it is the Vyana, not so much the physical blood also, but the lack of the oxygen and blood has weakened the flow of life energy. The Vyana being depleted makes for the numbness. The return and the tingling sensation is of the Vyana returning, and you'll actually feel sensation moving. Blood flow moves immediately, but sensation returning, you will feel as if something's spreading in the legs. And briefly there's a tingling until it settles. And that's the Vyana, life energy spreading to regain and reactivate the sensations and link the sensations back to you, the observing consciousness. Now, if you have mastered the Vyana, you're able to withdraw your sensory awareness from the physical body and then turn in if you so need to, or you're able to bring it back and infuse it again without moving the body. You come out of meditation, you notice your overall body spread the awareness and bring it back without moving, without restlessness, without agitation. And if you're doing it consciously, what you have received within, you can infuse into the Vyana as it spreads out into the body. And so spread the psychic influence or a higher spiritual influence into those parts and imprint them in the physical consciousness. So all of these things are very useful. The awareness, control and eventual mastery of the life force in the body boils down to becoming aware of, controlling and mastering these 5 Vayus, life force working in body. And the whole technology of Hatha Yoga rests upon mastering these energies. Eventually, though, the goal there is different. Having mastered these energies, you have got an overall mastery of the physical consciousness. The goal then is to stimulate the awakening of the Kundalini and the opening of the chakras, which is not relevant. But you can see how, with the mastery of the life forces in this way, the whole body becomes like a plastic instrument. You can literally do anything you want with the body, modify its processes and things like this. Sri Aurobindo comments, not only as a result of the mastery of life energy in the body, which would be the natural outcome of Hatha Yoga mastery, but as a result also of the spiritual consciousness now infused and mastering even the physical life energies by the spiritual force and the supramental consciousness infused through those. The degree of perfection is taken very far, and Sri Aurobindo observes that in his own body it has reached a point where he can even drink poison and it can pass harmlessly through the system without damaging anything. Under such circumstances, he said, there would be only 3 conditions in which he would leave his body. If it was shown to him that the work is not to be this time, or if I don't remember the third, the other one is by accident. But otherwise he had complete grip on the body through the consciousness, holding it, literally wielding it as an instrument, that he could do whatever was necessary. In fact, in the last week or so before he left his body, he let go. He allowed the body to follow through its natural process of decline. And at that point, because the doctors were doing their stuff, thinking that they were helping him and preventing his illness and all that, they gave him a report. So Nirodha, I think, comments on this. He was given a report that there was excess albumin in the urine. Next day it was back to normal. Just Sri Aurobindo showed that he could will it literally to come back to whatever it was that was required. And that was it. It was only when he decided to leave processes or even allowed them to go through whatever decline was inevitable once he had decided to withdraw. And then the rest is only a process. Willed, essentially. Otherwise, equally the same will could pull back and pursue in whatever way it was necessary. So we will, this is regarding the prana in the physical body, and we will take up a few more things perhaps next time and before we complete this chapter. The next class will be after a gap of 1 month, resuming on the 15th of July. And we will have the Sunday session as usual, and subsequently on Tuesday, which is 14th of June, we have a special observance of Panditji's birthday. And in the morning at 6 o'clock, we have a prayer here. You're all welcome to attend that. Otherwise, drop in during the day at any time to take prasad. And this text we will continue on 15th of July. For those who are interested, we will show some videos meanwhile of earlier talks or other sessions. I have a series of lectures because I will be going abroad. I will try, if possible, to have them webcast or to have them uploaded, and those will be shown here for those who are interested on Fridays and Sundays. On the eve of Panditji's birthday, that is Monday evening, we will show a video of one of his talks. So you're welcome to attend that also. We have briefly a few minutes if there are any questions or if anything you want to share. Monday 6:30. 6:30 on Monday. And then meditation 7 to 7:30. Yes. Yes. Yes, good question. Sri Aurobindo could have withdrawn without being sick. But in the process of withdrawal, there is a breakdown automatically, isn't it? If in that process there is work which can be done in the body consciousness, then that would be useful. So he could have quit as many yogis have done in the past and still do today. Some of them, they take what is called Jivita Samadhi, that is, they're fully conscious, alive, in full health. They sit down often in a state of Padmasana and ask a Samadhi to be built around them, and they withdraw when they are ready to. Or sometimes they say they ask to be left alone and then they leave the body and people come back. Well, either the body is now left, technically dead, or the body itself has been burnt up, turned into a pile of ash, or sometimes taken the form of flowers, which is the energy that they can direct on the body to change, to consume it, turn it into ash, etc. Now in Sri Aurobindo's case, these kinds of withdrawal were not relevant because the work was in the body consciousness and the focus was on transformation of the body. And so whatever had to be done, even in the withdrawal, every opportunity had to be used to push the limits of the body's capacity. You see this more obviously in the mother's case, where she began formally the withdrawal about 6 months before she left the body. And from the point she began that, the decline, the breakdown of the body started. And she had explained earlier that in order to prepare her body, nature had to gather the materials across 2000 years. And if she had to give up the body, she would have to give back to nature to put back those things. So when she began the process, and she said it would take 6 months. So when she began that process, it was about 6 months before there was an incident which we need not go into now. But it was clear at that point she made a gesture of withdrawal. Till the last, she insisted on making the body move. Now, for people attending on her, it was extremely difficult because the body would be in great pain. But then she explained, and Pranabda told us this. She said, in the cosmic balance, it makes a difference. So she had to force the body to push certain limits, even though the body would be in great pain, because the effort, she said, makes a difference in the cosmic balance. So in the work on the body consciousness, since the goal was transforming the body, the nature of the withdrawal also involved pushing it to its limits. But yes, technically one could have simply withdrawn if this was not required.
There was a reference about the soul, and I wanted to know, is it always necessary that the soul passes through evolution from any birth? Or does the soul also can take up directly the human body and stick to that?
Yes, yes. A soul does not need to pass through animal births if it did not begin as an evolutionary soul. So when a soul emerges from the divine as a tiny spark, and then the spark has to pass through a process gradually of developing its individuality, developing its personality, then it takes up life forms equivalent to its level of development and expression. So it's possible a soul comes in reasonably formed. It does not have to go through the lowest life forms, and it can enter directly into something which is intermediate, which may be animal, or a soul which is of a being which is non-evolutionary, belonging to some of the intermediate worlds, who now chooses to incarnate, can take on straight away a material human birth. But then they were already formed, individualized in a level of consciousness which was equivalent to a human awake awareness. If a soul which is not yet sufficiently developed takes on a human form prematurely, it would not be able to express sufficiently human capacities. So it would be what we call retarded, where there is an inferior development of the intellect. So the idea is this: the soul itself as a center of pure consciousness is developing a personality, and in the personality accumulating the ability to operate on different levels, gradations of substance, until it develops also the ability to operate in the domain of intellect and thought. And that's when properly it should take a human birth, because the character of humanity is expression in thought. But if it has not attained to thought expression, it will take an animal birth which is close enough, but matching its level of current development and expression. The soul itself may be conscious even in its essence, but unable to deal with material of a certain level of evolution. And so it takes the life form of that level. It's also possible that from the divine straight away a spark emerges fully formed to take a human birth and can begin the journey as a human being. There's nothing preventing that, because the divine can operate, and such would be, and especially if it comes with a special mission or power, we would say it is a vibhuti. So everything is possible. In practice, what you see in the large universal evolutionary upward movement, there is a consciousness, a kind of a baseline, we may say, of life energy, consciousness mixed, instinctive, which rises out expressing in trees, sensations, and then there is a group soul, there is a group identity, within which there are smaller individual formations. And at some point, they may coalesce to form a sufficiently distinct individuality which can then take birth in a more individualized consciousness, even among trees. So you will see among plants, there are plants where the individuality is not formed at all. They are always group. And then there are trees in which the individuality is so distinct, although they may be a family of trees. You walk up and you say, this tree is special. It is more conscious. And then they call it the king tree. It is like the leader of that whole cluster. Or sometimes there may be 2 or 3. So even within that gradation of consciousness, there may be individualizations, but not yet the rationalized expression. And so there will be evolutionary steps involving both individualization as well as levels of consciousness being organized. At any of these levels, something could enter directly, or generally something would be rising constantly from below, forming new centers and new individuations of consciousness. Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's the nature of the adventure. To go through complete self-loss, to complete self-discovery, and some souls choose not to do that. And so they associate themselves with some evolving soul and learn, share, and then grow through their participation by partial association, not taking a full birth, sometimes taking partial entry. And only when they have matured enough, they may take full birth to take on some form. So there's a huge variety of possibilities, and each one has, so to say, chosen their line of adventure. The 5 pranas are not directly associated with the chakras. They are 5 functions of life force within us. But the awakening of chakras tremendously amplifies their working.
You cannot concentrate in a particular center, for example, to enhance your prana.
So it is not by concentrating on the chakra that you will develop awareness of the 5 pranas, but by mastering the 5 pranas, you may be able to awaken the chakras more easily or awaken the kundalini more easily. So in fact, one of the core practices is the uniting the prana and apana until they cease to be different. The inflow and outflow becomes completely joined, perfectly one, and that's when you break free from sense of separate consciousness and experience of continuity with the universal life energy. That you are then practically transparent. The life energy flows in and out, and there's nothing to differentiate the incoming and outgoing in their quantity, and you are then at that point transparently an individual. So by manipulating them, your consciousness can be modified. Your narrow individuality dissolved into a universality, and the kundalini awakened, and so on. The opening of the chakras becomes easier through mastering the 5 pranas, not the other way around. This is the method of the Hatha Yoga.
The mastery of them comes only by the Shakti coming from above them.
When we use the word mastery, we have to be clear what we mean by that. There's a practical mastery within the current limitations, and then there is the divine perfection, which we may call true mastery. Divine perfection can only be attained by the supramental consciousness entering and completing that evolutionary development and divinizing. So if our definition of perfection is a divine perfection, mastery is a divine mastery, then without the supramental this is not possible. We may of course have a practical mastery, as many Hatha Yogis have, of all their biology functions, life functions, even ability to extend their life substantially, but not entirely. For yoga, the same results are attained by different means. We do not use the methods of Hatha Yoga for that, but the same physical development can be attained. For example, what I described of the mother her body being so plastic and so conscious, that kind of strain, but you never saw her doing exercises or needing to do exercises. She played the game of tennis, that's about it, but she didn't need to sit down and do asanas and pranayam. But the same result was attained by different means. And the different means you can see very simply from this description, it should be obvious. When the mental Purusha can seize on the life energies in the body and can directly manipulate them, we attain to the same result which you would have got through asanas and pranayam in the Hatha Yogic process. Before the mental Purusha has that kind of grip directly on those life energies, we may use asanas and pranayam to begin the process, or we may not use them at all and directly focus through the mind. This in fact is the method used closer to Raja Yoga, where the mind is used as a primary means to control the life energies. And they attain to a similar goal in perfecting the mental consciousness, but not necessarily perfecting the physical unless you have directed it in that for that purpose. In the integral yoga, we would use it consciously for the full perfection of the whole being. So the simple exercises that Mother gives, she says when you're climbing steps, become conscious and make each movement consciously. Most people stop with just making it conscious. But if you observe, when you make conscious, you become aware of the life energy behind the movement of the muscles. And if you put your attention in that direction, you can quickly gain a control and awareness and then a control of the life energies in the body consciousness while doing those movements. And then the act of walking done in this way can actually take the place of the asanas. But you must really put your consciousness in it with that intention. If you start with it and then lose your attention, you won't have the same result. Then you better do asanas also.
Going on unconsciously.
Yes.
The circulation and all that.
Right. So when you begin like this with conscious movements, and through conscious movements gain awareness of the life energies, you will find other things that the life energies are guiding are also coming into your awareness, like the blood circulation, like the digestive processes. So, for example, digestive process is linking the prana and the apana. When you are eating in, you are taking in material, which is the higher function of prana, and the digestive process converting and then and when you become conscious of the life energy, you will actually feel now today your digestion is sticky on this particular food. You ate food which was very heavy and the digestion is a little unsure of itself. You will feel it. And then you can will into it the life force and overcome whatever incapacity was there in the digestion. Or you feel your stomach is going to get loose. The apana is now unsteady. You can will it to tighten and not have loose motions, things like that. It will happen as a result of mastering or becoming aware of these 5 pranas. And that's how the yogi is able to slow down the breathing and even the heart rate consciously, because they are all under control of one or more of these pranas. Through the Vyana control, for example, you can change the body temperatures. This Swami Rama, I have mentioned this some last year perhaps, he was able to do in laboratory conditions, heating up one part of the palm by up to 6 degrees and cooling down another part of the palm by several degrees. And this is the control you get from the Vyana Vayu mastery. Or any other part of the body, one could similarly do things like that. Or making the finger dull, and then you can stick a pin and you don't feel pain, because you've withdrawn the sensational prana. Yes. This is what they do through the acupuncture. They play with the prana flows, prana nadis, and by blocking them you can make a certain part of the body numb, for example. or you can intensify them to heal a certain part of the body, and so on. But the same thing can be done internally just by application of the will. Yes. Release from the subjection to the body is not merely getting free to get out, but it is getting free in order to be able to master. And it will be the same theme which continues in the next chapter, release from the heart and the mind.